So we remind ourselves again today of our congregational goal that we've been talking about. To become and to make disciples through service and sacrifice. Over and over. You say that over and over. To become and to make disciples through service and sacrifice. We've been focusing on the first part for 3 weeks now. On becoming disciples. We're going to continue to talk about that today. Discipleship, as we've said, is a journey. It's not the end goal. It's the process of becoming Christ-like. For every single one of us, we are becoming who we were always been intended to be. Meaning, we're not there yet, but we're getting there. We're becoming truly human. As in the pre-fall, uncorrupted human. One of the worst things we can say is when we screw up and go, well, you're only human. But that's not the case, because when God created us human, He created us perfect. We're only fallen human. We're only sinful where we are today. We're meant to strive towards what we were always made to be as humanity. Humanity is supposed to be something good, something great, something creative, something progressive, something that builds and moves us forward. It's supposed to be something encouraging. So we aim towards that every day. The process of discipleship, it is the restoration of the original, perfect, sinless humanity that thrives and lives life to great fulfillment and joy. That's what we strive towards every day, to become. So far, we've touched on 3 general aspects of the process of that discipleship, that becoming a discipleship process. We've said that we must engage in a perpetual process of learning. We must learn every moment of every day and seek it out, right? We must accept the gospel message. We must make it our own. We must be in a relationship. Jesus must belong to me, and I must be able to convey that uniqueness in that relationship that I have with Him, because Jesus created us all different, each differently for a reason, right? And so He interacts with each of us differently, and therefore we learn different things. And we bring those things together. That's when we begin to learn how to become truly human once again. And the last thing we talked about last week is that we must make an unwavering commitment that stands the test of time, emotions, and whether I feel like it or not. Stands our feelings. Today I want to begin a discussion on the aspect of character and transformation. We are saved by grace and not by works, but that does not mean that the place of virtue and ethics is not just as, and even add more important to the disciple today as it was to the people of Israel under the law. Sometimes that passage that we read in our scripture reading from Jesus can befuddle us a little. Your righteousness must surpass even that of the Pharisees, but I thought it was saved by grace. Well, that's because if we're becoming human, then that means we're becoming what we were always intended to be, and that means we are becoming of greater character and virtue every day as well. There is a great difference between adherence to rules and transformation of character. That's what I think Jesus has brought us to teach us, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. Jesus' words have a tendency, when He speaks, He either creates great comfort or He ends up creating great distress. We see this tension throughout all of the Gospels. Sometimes Jesus speaks a word and we're comforted and distressed at the same time, right? So let's look at Matthew chapter 22. Turn with me over to Matthew chapter 22 and we'll read it. This is one of those moments where I think part of the crowd's going, yes, that was good. And the other part of the crowd's going, what are you talking about? And the other part of the crowd's going, that feels good, but at the same time, what do you mean? That can't be right. So Matthew chapter 22. Matthew chapter 22. Starting in verse 34. Matthew 22, verse 34 through 40. It says, but when the Pharisees heard that He had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Him a question to test Him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And He said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. As you imagine the crowd, as you imagine and think about the crowd that is present, okay? You have to think that many of those people, they find comfort in these words, right? And love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. All right, that's a whole lot easier than the how many ever hundreds of laws the Pharisees had, right? But others, like the ones who posed the question in the first place, the Pharisees, had to be completely distressed. First, you have the crowds that have been beaten down for centuries. They've been told that they are worthless, and that because they do not adhere to this or that law, that they are hopeless sinners. To hear that the law can be summed up as loving God and people can be a comfort. It's so much less stressful to filter all of our life decisions through two basic premises: love God and people, than to try to account for hundreds and hundreds of little laws. Jesus is validating those who are validating those who are poor, but still acting in a loving manner. He's saying that just because you're poor doesn't make you a sinner, right? On the other hand, you have, as usual, the Pharisees, the scribes, and the religious elite. They are, in this moment, completely distressed. This is a rule-bound society. We follow rules. What do we do tomorrow? Well, we do whatever the rule tells us to do, or rather not to do. And Jesus just walked in and he said, forget all the rules. Make your decisions based on this. Jesus walked into a rule-bound society and took all the rules away. Okay, that's going to create a little bit of panic, right? How are we supposed to keep the people in line? What about morality? What about righteousness? What about Sabbath? Aren't the people just going to go off and get into all kinds of trouble? They're all just going to go get drunk and have sex and do all these terrible things. We got to have rules. I mean, we feel that way sometimes too, don't we? We got to have rules. What if they took the speed limits off the roads? What if we just said, you need to act responsibly? But do you know why the Pharisees' list of rules were endless? Because life changes at an ever-quickening pace. It never ends and it always changes. And with every change, you need a new rule to manage that change. To this day, if you think about Judaism today, Judaism has been forced to continually add more and more rules to an ever-changing life in this world. For an Orthodox Jew, what do you define as work today with our advancements in technology and changes in society? When you used to think of work then, it would be, okay, don't do manual labor. Simple enough, right? But what if your job today means sitting down in a chair, pushing buttons on a computer and flipping switches? Well, that wouldn't sound like work to the Pharisees, but today we go, well, that's work, so we need a new law for that. So, that means that Sabbath regulations must change as well. So now for many Orthodox Jews today, and I'm not exaggerating, this is real, this is true, okay? There is a very, very, very large, actually the largest population of Jewish people outside of Israel is just by Detroit, where I grew up, okay? And there is a very strong group of Orthodox Jews there, and they are not allowed on the Sabbath to drive a car. They are not allowed to flip a light switch. They are not allowed to use a computer. They are not allowed to do so many other things that have been made into laws that cannot be done on the Sabbath. Okay? As life happens, we have to add laws because there's so many new things. For a righteousness bound in law It's impossible. It's an impossibly endless burden that gets heavier and heavier and more impossible every moment of every day. What if every single day from the beginning of creation we added one page to this? Okay? We're lucky if every day we read one page of this. How big would this get? How much of a burden would... I mean, it's hard enough to read all of this. How much of a burden would that be? I can only imagine what the Pharisees' law book would look like. Right? Imagine what it would look like today. Okay? You think our Bible's big. Okay? Try to carry that into church every Sunday. Who would attain righteousness except for the scholar who's attained his doctorate in 13 different ways? Right? How could you ever attain righteousness if it was based on all of that? Now, it's not that Jesus doesn't care about rules. You want to get that right. It's not that Jesus does not care about rules, but rather it's that Jesus cares about the purpose and the heart of the rule. He doesn't care about the rule itself. He cares about the purpose behind the rule. What Jesus teaches us is not rule keeping, but rather he teaches us character forming. He tells us, forget the rules and work on forming the character so you don't need a rule to tell you what to do when you're faced with a decision. Here's the problem with rule keeping. Rules take the decision out of our hands. It takes the responsibility away from me. It's no longer my responsibility to be moral. All I have to do is do what I'm told. I don't need to make any decisions for myself. I don't need to think because the rule thinks for me. It tells me what to do, not why to do it. Now, rules don't necessarily sound like such a bad thing until we reach a point in our life when, well, it doesn't fit so neatly into the rules. Well, there isn't a rule for this moment, so what do I do? Now that I have to think for myself, and I've been rule-bound for so long that all I've done is follow rules, I don't know how to do it. I haven't done it before. I don't know what to do. Moral decisions. I don't have the character form to make moral decisions because all my moral decisions have been made for me. Without my control structure, without my rules dictating my moves and decisions, I'm lost. N.T. Wright in his book, After You Believe, gives a really good illustration of this. He writes about a former rugby star who we heard speaking one day on the topic of character. In his book it reads, he was talking about the massive changes that had taken place in the game in the last 10 or 15 years, with the increased professionalization and the enormous pressure on young players to produce results. Now, N.T. Wright's from England, so he's a big rugby fan, not football. So, he says, the players today are overcoached. They are taught dozens of moves, how to respond to this situation, how to defend against that strategy, how to keep the game under control, how to open it up. But few of them any longer play the game for fun, acquiring as they do that sixth sense for how things work, which would enable them to improvise in totally new situations. As a result, they're lost when something new and unexpected happens. They haven't been given a set of rules for what to do in those circumstances. What they lack is a deeply formed character which would read the game with a kind of second nature and come up with a shrewd and quick solution. You see what he's saying there? They're taught so thoroughly every action and reaction that they don't know how to act for themselves. When something they haven't been taught before happens, they go, well, which way do I go? They don't know what to do. A dependence on rules, it takes away our ability to possess a second nature or a natural ability to adapt to something new or different. When life throws us a curveball, and we've never seen a curveball before, we have no clue how to respond or what the right thing is, because it falls outside our control system of rules and regulations. We know what to think because we've been told what to think, but we don't know how to think. That's the plight that the Pharisees and the Jewish people are in. They know what to think because they've been told, but they don't know how to think, so they can't come up with anything new. This is what Jesus is teaching the crowds. He is teaching them how to think, rather than telling them what to think. Life changes every day, in every moment. And believe it or not, Scripture does not have specific rules for things like computer usage, human cloning, industrial pollution, gun control, and so many other things that are issues that we have to deal with today, in this moment. And what we're finding is we're finding so many churches toting the line and going on with whatever happens in society and is the popular opinion because, well, the Bible doesn't say anything about pollution. It takes character to understand that we need to take care of creation and do this and that. It doesn't say anything about gun control because there were guns in there. If we don't have a deeply formed character that teaches us to think through new situations based on the love of God and people, then we're going to get stuck when new decisions like these present themselves. We'll be dumbfounded, and by the time we've collected our thoughts to make an educated decision, an educated, God-pleasing decision, we're going to find that the moment's already past us. One place I think we see this happen all too often is in the place of young adults as they go off to college. So many young adults, they fall prey to the temptations that the absence of boundaries and the sudden responsibility of hard life decisions brings upon them. Suddenly, they're responsible for their own study habits. They decide when they go to class. They decide whether they're early or whether they're late. They decide if they even go to class at all. They decide whether alcohol and partying is a good idea because nobody's there to tell them no. They decide about sex, love, charity, church, cleanliness, laundry, diets. All those things where the decisions were made for them before. So many decisions are suddenly thrown upon them all at once. Parents sit at home and they don't understand. How could such a good kid, how could a kid who behaved so well, was so pleasant, and is so well behaved, how could this kid make such bad decisions? And trust me, I've seen this so much just from being in college. They refused all those things at home. They were clean. They had good study habits. They were good, generous people. They showed up at church every Sunday. What happened that they suddenly made such terrible life decisions? Well, young adults in so many situations were so rule-bound that they were never taught to think for themselves. They were never taught and developed character. And so when these questions were presented before them that were always answered for them, so they had to answer themselves, they went with what felt right rather than what was right. Because they didn't know the difference. I was a good student because my parents made me. I did not stay out late because my parents would have killed me. I ate healthy because that was what was given to me. How many decisions did they have to make for themselves? How much character was formed at home? They were given rules to follow, but there's so many, and this is not all, don't get me wrong, this is not all, but I think I see this so much, especially in church situations, where kids are going off to college from church families. And I know this sounds bad, but this is really what's happening. If you go to schools, even like Rochester College and Harding and things like that, you see this all over the place. One of the minister now who's over at Rochester Church of Christ, he came over to Rochester College to teach, and he goes, I am completely amazed at how many ministry students, I look at them and go, are they even Christians? Because they grew up in the church, they were good church kids, but the character was not formed for them to make good decisions when suddenly the responsibility was theirs. So many were given rules to follow, but not allowed to make the decisions that would teach them the character. They weren't allowed to fail and fall. They didn't learn the character needed to come through successfully when unexpected and new trials arrived. This is what Jesus is now teaching. And what made the Pharisees so nervous. He was taking the responsibility of decision making, and he was taking it out of the hands of the religious authorities. He was saying, you don't get to make the decisions for them anymore. But he was saying to the crowd, you are responsible to make your own decisions. Filtering the whole law through love God and love people, that's dangerous. Because now that doesn't say, what should I do in this situation? Well, what about this situation? Well, what about that one? Well, what about this one? Well, Jesus is saying, take these two things, and I want you to decide for yourself what that means. He's not saying you're going to get it right, but he's saying you need to work through that process yourself in order to get it right the next time. If you don't know the process, how are you going to get to the answer? That's what he's saying. And this made the Pharisees so nervous. Jesus says, you know that you're supposed to love God, and you know that you're supposed to love the people around you. So knowing those things, in this moment, which decision would be the one that love would make? That's what Jesus is asking the crowds. How are we to learn if we never have to go through the process ourselves? In school, I was really good at math. I really did not like it, but I was good at it. Just like every kid in school, I would go through and I would say, math is useless and it has no life application. What is the point? Right? I'm sure you've heard this before, right, Jeannie? What's the point? I'm never going to need this. Especially when you get on to things like algebra and trigonometry and so many other calculus and that kind. Well, what am I ever going to need that for? Even though nowadays we go, well, they probably didn't need that. But because I did it well, I would get my work, and I would put down the answer, and I would turn it in, and I would get it right, but I would always get marked down because I didn't show my work. This drove me crazy. Why should I have to show my work if I get the right answer? Because if I do not learn the process, then when more complicated equations come up later down the road, am I still going to be able to get the right answer? And I think this is the challenge for us. This is what Jesus is teaching us. Don't just learn the answer. Learn the process to get to the answer so that when life throws you something that you haven't quite found the rule for yet, that you know how to answer it. That you have the character to make good, God-pleasing decisions. Knowing the answer is not good enough. The idea of catechism in Catholic and Lutheran schools, it's terrible. Because catechism teaches us the answers, but not the process. If we don't know why we got from step 1 to step 2, then how am I supposed to get from step 1 to step 2 in my life? How am I supposed to not just know the answer, but understand it and believe the answer? That's the difference between knowledge and belief. I might know that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but if I don't put 2 oranges and 2 oranges in my hands and put them together and go, oh, that's why it equals 4, then I'm never going to necessarily believe it strong enough that when somebody shows me something different, then I'm going to be able to hold on to what I know is true. If we know the answer but not the process, then when I receive a new question that I'm not familiar with, I don't stand a chance. Something you'll find in math is that everything is connected. It's amazing how much in math everything is connected. If I can learn the basic processes. There are many times that I don't need to be taught new equations because the new question arises, and because I understand the process of the last one, I can figure out how to work through this one too. As disciples, we are not called to follow a set of rules and answers to every single question for us. But rather, we are called to live in a virtuous manner because we've been taught to think differently. And through thinking differently, we have developed character. Remember that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus did not abolish the law, but rather, it seems that he increased the requirements of it. He said, "You've heard it said that you should not murder, but I say, don't hate. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but Jesus said, do not lust. The law says an eye for an eye, but Jesus says, turn the other cheek. The law says love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but Jesus says, love both of them." It doesn't sound like Jesus made it easier. He made it harder. Jesus requires more, not less. The difference is that he has now put the responsibility of the decision-making on our shoulders. He said, "You are adults, and I'm going to let you act like adults, making decisions like mature adults." He is treating us not like children, because children need rules. But adults don't need rules. Adults need character. Jesus says the law was given because of their hardness of heart. Jesus is calling us to live lives that have an open, compassionate, and merciful heart. He's saying the law was given because they had too hard of a heart to act in a mature manner with mature character. And Jesus says, but you, I'm calling you not to act with hardness of heart, but rather to live with an open, compassionate, merciful heart that doesn't need rules because it's got character. He is calling us to live as though we are mature adults that think through every decision. An adult doesn't need a speed limit to drive at a safe speed. Now, note something there. If that's the case, then age is not necessarily an indicator of adulthood or maturity. Because how many adults do we see driving at, even with a speed limit, irresponsible speeds? Okay. Jesus is calling us to maturity and adulthood that many adults do not have. He's calling us to something more. He's calling us to be adults that live like adults rather than adults who live like children. It's every children's desire to one day become a race car driver. It's every adult's responsibility to realize that I can't drive like a race car driver. The responsibility of making good decisions, of knowing what it means to love, and of applying that love in every area of our life, it lies on nobody's shoulders but our own. It is not the responsibility of the law. We are guided by love, forming good character. We should know the difference between right and wrong without somebody having to tell us the difference. When we find ourselves in the wrong unknowingly, it's probably because we cheated the process, because we wrote down the answer instead of working through. And we tossed off responsibility and maturity for the sake of selfish desire. Jesus has trusted us. He's trusted us to become something more. To be a people of character and of renewed minds. To think through life differently than the way the world does. As we continue to work our way through a life of discipleship, we need to seek to think differently in every single moment. To think with character, rather than to think with what we've been told or what we know, or this or that. Let us learn to apply love in every circumstance. Let us see that where the law and rules are silenced, we can say with confidence that love always speaks. Maybe we need to hear that one more time. Where we cannot find a rule or a law to apply, love always speaks into that moment. And it takes character to see